Okay, there are 5 major cell types within bone, and each of this have their own specialized form and function. Now, osteogenic cells are a form of stem cell we find within the periosteum and endosteum. Osteoblasts are the bone-forming cells, and osteocytes are the mature bone cells. We have bone-lining cells, also called periosteal cells, which basically monitor the existing compact bone. And the osteoclasts are these giant multinucleated immune cells that basically break down the bony matrix. So osteogenic cells are also called osteoprogenitor cells. Now, these are mitotically active stem cells in the periosteum and endosteum. When stimulated, they can differentiate into osteoblasts or bone lining cells. So you might wonder, what is the stimulation for osteogenic cells to differentiate? Well, typically damage, where the bone needs to be repaired. What we find then is that these osteogenic cells are a nice source of additional stem cells for bone repair, and some remain as osteogenic stem cells within the periosteum and endosteum. That way you always have some capacity for bone repair. Now, osteoblasts can come from the osteogenic cells, and the function of osteoblasts is to secrete a bone forming material called osteoid. Osteoid is made up of collagen and calcium binding proteins. And the collagen is actually what makes up 90% of bone protein. It's a very tough type of protein. And calcium binding proteins are necessary for sequestering or holding on to the calcium phosphate minerals that make bone hard. Now, osteoblasts are also actively mitotic, so that osteoblasts can divide into more blasts to help make more bone or repair bone. Now, you can see the osteogenic stem cells here can divide and differentiate into osteoblasts, which are the bone-forming cells, so they're responsible for bone growth. Now, osteocytes are the mature bone cells. Now, what makes an osteocyte mature is the fact that it gets trapped in a lacuna. The lacuna is a space where these cells can no longer divide because they trap themselves in a bony cavity called lacuna. The function of osteocytes then is to just monitor and maintain the existing bony matrix. They act as stress or strain sensors so that mechanical stimuli like increased force on a bone can help osteocytes to help to communicate information between other cell types so that bone remodeling or bone kind of reformation can occur. So what's pretty cool then is these osteocytes can direct the reforming of bone even later on in adulthood. Now, bone lining cells are flat cells on the bony surfaces that are believed to help maintain the outer matrix. And on the external bone surface, these cells are called periosteal cells. And on the internal surfaces, they're called endosteal cells. Again, bone lining cells can also come from the osteogenic cells. Now, osteoclasts are very different here. Osteoclasts are not derived from those osteogenic cells. Rather, the osteoclasts are cells that are derived from hematopoietic stem cells. So instead of having an osteogenic origin, osteoclasts are these giant multinucleated cells that are formed by the fusion of many different macrophages. Remember, macrophages are an immune cell that can break down material, and in this case, the osteoclasts break down bone. So when they're active, they actually form little depressions called resorption bays, and resorption means the breakdown of bone. And cells that have a ruffled border, and they can actually help increase the surface area for enzyme degradation of bone. These also help seal off an area of surrounding matrix. So remember the osteocytes, the mature osteoblasts that basically just monitor and maintain the existing bony mineralized matrix. This differs from the osteoclasts because osteoclasts are the giant multinucleated cells that are immune in origin, and they basically help to resorb or break down the bony matrix. Now, compact bone is something we saw earlier, and we said that was what essentially lines the outer surfaces of your bones. It's also called lamellar bone because lamella are these basically layers of bone. And compact bone is made of osteons, canals, canaliculi, and interstitial and circumferential lamella. Now, the osteon is what we call a Haversian system, and the osteum is the structural unit of compact bone. It consists of an elongated cylinder, and they have concentric circles that interlock. These are made of lamella, and lamella are basically the interlocking rings of bone that form an osteon. Now, the lamella contain collagen fibers that run in different directions. This helps the osteons to withstand stress and resist twisting, and this eventually makes bone stronger than steel in terms of tensile strength. Now, bone salts are also found between collagen fibers, which makes bone hard. So looking at the example here of an osteon, you see there's these concentric rings of bone called lamella, and the collagen fibers within these lamella run at opposite angles. That way it resists different types of stress here. The very center of the osteon contains blood vessels and nerve fibers within a space called the central canal, or Haversian canal. And it turns out that these blood vessels help to nourish the bone from the inside. And these canaliculi are essentially small canals that help to transmit nutrients deep within bone. Now, these canaliculi are linked up to a central canal that runs through the core of each osteon, contains your blood vessels and nerve fibers. That's what you saw on the last slide. And the perforating canals are the ones that are actually run perpendicular or right angles to the central canal. And they basically just help to connect the blood and nerves of nearby central canals. So, Canaliculi are the hair-like canals that connect lacunae, or spaces within bone, to each other. And they basically are like the irrigation ducts of your bony tissue because they help to transmit nutrients deep within bone. Lacunae are the small cavities that contain osteocytes, and these osteocytes are nourished by the nutrients that travel through the canaliculi. Now, osteoblasts that secrete bony matrix maintain contact with each other, and they communicate via gap junctions. That way the osteocytes can tell osteoblasts, how they might want to remodel the bone based on the stresses that are placed on it. Now, when the matrix hardens, these osteoblasts get trapped into spaces called lacunae, and that way they form osteocytes. It's also when the canaliculi form. It allows for communication of all osteocytes within an osteon. Now, other forms of lamella or layers of bone consist of interstitial and circumferential lamella. The interstitial lamella are found between osteons, and the circumferential lamella surround the entire outside of the bone. And so what this slide shows is a really nice summary of all those terms here. So remember, out here we see compact bone. This is spongy bone. Only compact bone is made of complete osteons. So if you zoom in on the compact bone here, you see, okay, there's an osteon, there's one. Remember, the osteons are basically interlocking cylinders or concentric rings of lamella, and each lamella is basically a tube of bone. And between each tube, you find little spaces called lacunae. So if you zoom in here on an osteon, which you can see down here, you find, okay, here's our lamella again, those rings of bone. And between the lamella, we have our lacunae containing osteocytes. These osteocytes are all interconnected by little extensions that connect the cell to cell through gap junctions. And these cell extensions connect through canaliculi, which are these tiny little hair-like projections whose function is to basically transmit nutrients from the central canal deep within the bone itself. And you can see that illustrated really here in our light microscopy image of bone. This is one osteon. Here's our central canal, and you can see our lacunae with osteocytes kind of interspersed all throughout. Now these radial lines that are projecting away are all the canaliculi. It almost looks like a little fractured glass or something. These little tiny lines here are the canaliculi, which are small canals that help to connect osteocyte to osteocyte as well as the central canal. Now, remember, the osteon is a whole circular type of structure. But what we need then is actually a type of material to fill the space between osteons. We call this interstitial lamella. So right here we have interstitial lamella. It actually fills the spaces between osteons. And then surrounding the whole outside of bone, we got the circumferential lamella, which go around the whole circumference of that bone. Now on the outside of bone, it's lined with periosteum, which basically serves as the attachment point for tendons and ligaments, and has your osteogenic stem cells that can help to replenish the broken bone. Now down each osteon we have a central canal, and these canals go down the length of the osteon, which goes along the length of the bone, and these central canals contain lots of blood vessels and nerve fibers. So if bone breaks, it will bleed a lot because these blood vessels are very abundant within these osteons. And then there's also a lot of nerve fibers in bone, so if bone breaks, it will hurt a lot because those nerve fibers are going to be, irritated. Now, what connects these central canals together perpendicularly are these Volkmann's canals or perforating canals, and they essentially allow for blood vessels to intercommunicate between these canals and also allow them to go down deep into bone and then bring blood also more superficial within bone. Now, spongy bone appears more poorly organized, but it's actually very organized. And what's interesting is that spongy bone lines up along lines of stress. So if you place stress on a bone in a particular way, like if you take up a sport like tennis or basketball, and you start using bones in a certain way, it turns out the spongy bone will remodel and reform along the lines of stress that are placed on those bones. So the trabeculae are basically like cables in the suspension bridge, and they help to confer strength to the bone itself. Now, you don't find any complete osteons in spongy bone, but the trabecula do contain lamella and osteocytes that are interconnected by canaliculi. The reason why lamella and osteocytes are here is that spongy bone used to be compact bone, but it was broken down by the osteoclasts and turned into a kind of a spongy type of appearance. Now, capillaries in the endosteum are essentially what help nourish spongy bone from the inside. Now, looking at spongy bone here, you can see compact bone on the outside. You have spongy bone sandwiched in the middle. If you zoom in here, this is spongy bone under an electron microscope. And you can see it's got this trabecula or honeycomb appearance. There would be endosteum lining these spaces. And if you actually looked at a cross-section of the microscopic organization of spongy bone, there would be no complete osteons here, only incomplete lamella, but there would be living osteocytes monitoring and maintaining this existing spongy bone. Now, in terms of what bone is made of, well, it's made of both organic and inorganic components. The organic components of bone, which are basically carbon-containing, hence the name organic, include the cells like osteogenic cells, blasts, and cytes, and bone-lining cells, and osteoclasts, as well as the osteoid. Now, the osteoid is what makes up 1/3 of the bony matrix. An osteoid is this material that's secreted by osteoblasts. Osteoid is made of ground substance and collagen fibers. In the ground substance of osteoid, you've got calcium-binding proteins that help to, make this mineralized later, and that helps to contribute to the high tensile strength and flexibility of bone because of all the collagen fibers as well. Now, the organic components help to form some resilience of bone because of these sacrificial bonds. What we find is that between the collagen molecules and bone, sometimes there's actually little break points here. That way, if bone receives a lot of stress, we have sacrificial bonds that can help absorb some of the shock on that bone. Just like in newer cars, there are these crimple zones where basically if a car gets hit in a certain way, it's designed to crunch and absorb the force rather than bounce off the car, which can damage the person, inside. Just like our bones have these sacrificial bonds, which are basically there to crunch and absorb some of the force that's placed on bones. But these can reform and eventually helps to dissipate energy and prevents fracture of bone overall. Now, if there's no additional trauma, these bonds can reform. Now, the inorganic components of bone are the hydroxyapatite. Now, this makes up 65% of your bone by mass, and hydroxyapatites are basically mineral salts. Now, they're mostly calcium phosphate crystals that surround collagen fibers, and they're attracted by those calcium-binding proteins we talked about in osteoid. And it turns out that hydroxyapatites are what are responsible for the hardness and resistance to compression that bone has. So think of bone as being like a mineralized matrix. Now, inorganic components also is what contributes to the fact that bone is about as strong as steel in resisting compression. Half as strong as steel in resisting compression, but as strong as steel in terms of resisting tension. Now, it turns out that bones last long after death because of the mineral composition. They don't decay as quickly as other tissues. And what's pretty cool, too, is you can look at the mineral composition of ancient people, which can tell you about their diet and lifestyle and other environmental factors that may have been exposed to.